In the aftermath of the genocide, German racial scientists continued to use Namibia as a field laboratory and the African peoples who had survived as their subjects. In 1908, a eugenicist called Eugen Fischer travelled to the small town of Rehoboth, home to a people of mixed Boer and African heritage who called themselves the Rehoboth Bastards. Fischer and his assistants spent months photographing, measuring, and examining the inhabitants of this town, people whose descendants still live here.
The person at the bottom there is my grandfather, Malcolm McNabb, and above him is his brother, Charles McNabb. My grandfather used to talk a lot about what they did. Measurements, the eyes, the nose, the lips, the ears, hair, etc. They was not aware of the nature of the experiment.
Lying in the vaults of an archive in modern-day Namibia, Eugen Fischer's original files and photographs remain as he left them a century ago. They reveal his methods and also his aims.
Here Eugen Fischer has lined the different pictures up next to each other to try to trace very specific facial features like the eyes or the noses. And the reason he's done this is to try to show how very specific African facial features like high cheekbones and the drawn-out eyes that represent the African genes are very prominent and become more prominent through the generations. Eugen Fischer came to Namibia to prove one basic point, and that was that racial mixing was always bad, and that the African gene is dominant over the white gene.
Fischer's work in Rehoboth sealed his reputation as one of Germany's leading racial scientists. It also brought him recognition from a nation that was then experiencing the greatest influx of immigration the world had ever seen. In the first years of the 20th century, the ethnic makeup of America was being transformed as millions of immigrants poured into her great cities. Many of those who feared that mass immigration would lead to widespread racial mixing looked to the ideas of eugenics, an increasingly powerful science.
Eugenics flourished, mutated, and went out of control when it got to the United States. And the irony is that the eugenics movement in the United States, which certainly descended directly from Galton, had the great advantage of having a lot of money, a huge amount of money.
Some of that money was used to establish the Eugenics Records Office, ran by the infamous Charles Davenport. In order to defend the health and purity of the white race, Davenport and his followers sought to identify those classes and those races in America whom they considered genetically unfit. Identified and monitored, the scientists would then take control of their lives and their fertility.
Once you were identified as a certain class, it meant what school you could go to, what cemetery you could be buried in, where you could live. It was a matter of life and death. Marriage laws were established in dozens of states around the United States, saying that people could not marry outside of their group. Blacks could not marry whites, Indians could not marry blacks. In Virginia, if you married the wrong person, meaning interracial marriage, they would unmarry you, they would invalidate your marriage.
27 states passed eugenics marriage laws, and the eugenicists spread their message using the new medium of cinema. The propaganda was intended to protect the genetic health of the white race. This would be achieved by eradicating those deemed unworthy through forced mass sterilization.
They went about methodically tracking ancestry and targeting bloodlines for extinction. That's eugenics, the effort to create a white, master, blonde, blue-eyed master race by wiping out other bloodlines until they were left only with themselves and people who resembled themselves. And what's important here is that these people thought they were saving humanity. These people thought they were liberals. They were reformers.
Eugenics was a worldwide movement. In Sweden, an official program forcibly sterilized 60,000 people, mental patients and members of the ethnic minorities. In Britain, the Eugenics Society received widespread support from across the political spectrum. But it was in Germany that the radical ideas of the American eugenics movement found its most receptive audience.
Anything connected to America would seem to be modern, progressive, scientific, democratic, reasonable, so it must be good. America was the future, the force of the future. Secondly, I think that many European eugenicists, including the Germans, liked the tone adopted by American eugenicists, which was very radical and sort of no-nonsense, and they didn't use euphemisms. They said exactly what they meant.
The Americans provided more than just inspiration. American foundations also bankrolled the development of German eugenics. This was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology and Human Heredity. In the 1930s, the men and women who worked here received grants from the American Rockefeller Foundation. And the leading scientist here was the man who made his name in Namibia, Eugen Fischer. Under the Nazis, Fischer was empowered to sterilize the racially mixed people of Germany's Rhineland, 400 of them, all children. The majority of those sterilized by the Nazis before 1939, however, were the mentally ill. But when the Nazis began their war, they abandoned sterilization in favor of adult euthanasia, the Nazi euphemism for murder. The victims of this program were amongst the first people gassed by the Nazis. But the program wasn't restricted to the mentally ill.